Well, hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Adam's Music Box. It was on this day that Syd Barrett left Pink Floyd, and it was, of course, a long process that most people know about because of the tabloid innuendo surrounding it and because of the genuine questions about mental health that it raised. But today I want to talk about Syd Barrett's music because he was a musical genius, maybe driven mad by his genius like others before him. The world will never know. But let's talk about what we do know, because in his comparatively short time in Pink Floyd and in the music scene more generally, he left a rather substantial body of his original work. And it was characterized by several things. What do I mean by the sound of surprise? Well, if you look at it at a cursory level, most of Syd Barrett's songs were a bit like psychedelic versions of English folk songs, but they were really quite different. When listening to a Syd Barrett song, there's a lot of tension. It starts out with him strumming some chords, everything's in 4/4 until it's not. He'll go from major to minor at an unexpected juncture. He'll go from something with a very familiar harmony to dissonance at a totally unexpected time. He'll jump from 4/4 into an odd meter for a few bars. Again, totally unexpected. And this is what builds the tension in his songs. But it's less of a dramatic tension and more of an almost musically witty tension. In other words, he's lulling you into a false sense of security, and then he's like, "Ah, gotcha," like someone with a comedic zinger at the end of a spontaneous joke. Someone who adds witticisms into every conversation. And the lyrics, of course, really complement that style of music because they are sort of absurdist, but in an almost childlike way. It's very much unlike the Pink Floyd that came after Syd. Syd's lyrics were whimsical, they were fantastical, but inserted in them were interesting philosophical messages about life, loneliness, conformity, isolation, perhaps all of the things that Syd was quite possibly and maybe even likely dealing with in his head. And he poured that into his music, but without ever being grim, without ever being humorless. Everything about his music was making you laugh, making you smile, while also making you think and keeping you on your toes because of that surprise. Sid was, of course, the person who, without whom there would be no Pink Floyd, because on all of the first album, he wrote all of the songs, he wrote all of the original singles, and it was only when he started to mentally lose himself that the others started to force themselves really to become songwriters and composers in their own right. And one could further say that of all the famous bands that have either lost a founding member or who have changed important songwriters or leaders in midstream, no band was changed more because of that than Pink Floyd. Think about it. When Genesis switched from Peter Gabriel to Phil Collins, it was pretty seamless. And until they decided consciously to change their sound a bit in the early 80s, they kind of continued about where they left off. The Doobie Brothers were always more of a collective band, and Michael McDonald certainly added new sounds, but they didn't exactly give up their pre-existing sound. And we could say Van Halen, obviously the main instrumentalists and main songwriter, Eddie Van Halen, he remained even when singers famously changed from Roth to Hagar. But when Pink Floyd got rid of Sid, well, there's a point of argument there, but when Sid exited the band changed totally because the other founding members, Roger Waters, Rick Wright, and Nick Mason, had to force themselves to write, as did new member David Gilmour. And what eventually happened was Roger Waters became the leader and changed the band almost completely. There was always some of that element of the original Pink Floyd, but it was very different because Roger's lyrics extremely poetic, but also very straightforward in the sense that he's not hiding his message behind a veil of innuendo and obscure references and fantasy. His lyrics were about real life. They were about war and peace. They were about losing a parent. They were about political corruption and politically sadistic motives. They were about psychopathy. They were about staying sane in an unsane world, about charity, about empathy towards fellow men, about people being betrayed by the government. Very concrete things. You could write essays about that, where with Syd, he's much more of a tease. He's much more dancing around the meaning in order to get you there, where Roger is driving in a straight line with his themes towards it. And those two, that sort of yin and yang of the original Pink Floyd versus the Pink Floyd that became stratospherically popular worldwide, is itself very interesting because each member of Pink Floyd felt deeply affected by the loss of Syd from the band. They all wrote songs about it. They've all discussed it in their own ways. Syd was probably the only member of Pink Floyd that the others didn't hate, because they all ended up hating each other at one point or another, or suing each other. Quite ironically, Roger Waters filed his first of many lawsuits against David Gilmour on the same day, but 20 years later, that Syd left Pink Floyd. And so it's a very interesting story. I actually remember exactly where I was listening to the Jim Ladd radio show in 2006 when Syd finally died. Of course, just because Syd left Pink Floyd, it wasn't his immediate exit from the music industry. He recorded two solo albums, which were very much in the same vein of the songs he wrote for Pink Floyd, but with more stripped down arrangements. It was Barrett and the Madcap Laughs, two great albums indeed, which is just essentially Syd naked in front of the microphone with some backing, but a lot of it is just him and his guitar. And you can really feel the complexity masquerading as psychedelic simplicity that is implicit, say that 3 times fast, in Syd Barrett's writing. And for those of you who don't know the story, Syd was a charming, talented guy, but the minute Pink Floyd got famous, he started to withdraw. He would sometimes stand on stage, refusing to play his guitar, then pretending like he was going to play, and then, just stand there catatonic. He did that once on a television show in San Francisco where he refused to mime to the tape, and he started saying things that his bandmates thought were increasingly nonsensical. And so David Gilmour was brought in, and the band was temporarily 5 men because when Syd decided not to play, David would play. And eventually, Rick Wright tells the story of when he was living with Syd at that point, and he says to Syd when he's about to go to a gig, "Oh, I'm just going down the street for a pack of cigarettes." 5 hours later, he comes back from a gig on the other side of the country, and Syd's just sitting there and says to Rick, "Oh, have you got the cigarettes?" Blissfully unaware, so we think, that it was just a lie to more or less inform him without informing him that the band was carrying on. It's a very sad story, but Sid's music itself shouldn't really be seen as melancholy. One could read that into it ex post facto, but taken at face value, it really is interesting and fun music. The sound of whimsy, but more importantly, the sound of surprise. So, although he died in 2006 after retreating totally from public life in the early 70s, Syd Barrett's music will always stand as a testament to one man's genius. And I'm sure many were influenced by him, but no one was ever like him, including the people that he formed his own band with. Well, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time here on Adam's Music Box. Bye bye.